Welcome to a very tragic story. Here we delve into the darker chapters of history, exploring events that remind us of the fragility of life and the enduring impact of tragedy. While February 14th is often associated with love and celebration, it's also a date that has witnessed its share of sorrow and loss. Today we'll examine several tragic events that occurred on this date, exploring the circumstances, the consequences, and the lessons we can learn. From ancient massacres to modern-day attacks, these stories serve as a reminder that even on days meant for joy, tragedy can strike. We approach these narratives with sensitivity and respect, aiming to understand the human cost of these events and to honor the memory of those affected. Number 1. The Strasbourg Massacre, 1349. The Black Death, a bubonic plague pandemic, ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. Amidst the widespread fear and uncertainty, Jewish communities were often scapegoated, falsely accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. The winter of 1349 hung heavy over Strasbourg. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and fear. It had been 2 years since the Black Death began its terrible march across Europe, leaving behind mountains of the dead. The people of Strasbourg watched helplessly as their loved ones fell sick, their skin darkening with painful buboes before the fever carried them away. Priests whispered prayers, doctors bled their patients, but nothing worked, and so whispers turned to accusations. "Why are they not dying like us?" someone murmured in the market. "The Jews," another spat. "They poisoned the wells." Of course, it wasn't true, but truth mattered little in the face of desperation. Rumors spread like wildfire, igniting the worst in human nature. Across the Holy Roman Empire, towns erupted into violence. Jews were dragged from their homes, thrown into flames, and left as nothing but ash. At first, Strasbourg held firm. The city's rulers, wise men, or so they claimed, argued against the madness consuming the neighboring cities. The Jews were part of Strasbourg's life. They were bankers, scholars, traders. Killing them, the council warned, would not stop the plague. But fear is louder than reason. In February 1349, the city's political balance shifted. The powerful guilds, fueled by resentment and economic greed, forced a change in leadership. With the old protectors out of power, the gates of hell swung open. The decision was swift. The Jews had to die. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, though there was no love to be found, a massive wooden platform was built in the Jewish cemetery. It was no ordinary structure. It was a pyre, a fire pit for the living. The city guards stormed into the Jewish quarter. Mothers clutched their children, husbands shielded their wives, but there was no mercy to be found. Some were dragged from their homes, others were given a twisted choice, baptism or death. Many refused to abandon their faith. The fire roared as if it had a hunger of its own. One by one they were thrown in, the old, the young, men, women, and children. Some screamed, some prayed, some held hands, refusing to let go even as the flames swallowed them. Close to 2,000 souls perished that day, burned alive by their own neighbors. Their crime? Simply being Jewish. By the end of it, Strasbourg's Jewish community was no more. The few who survived were banished, forced to wander a world that had turned its back on them. Their homes were ransacked, their wealth divided among those who had once been their friends. The city moved on, as cities always do, but the stain remained. The massacre of 1349 was not just an act of fear, but of greed and hatred. The events of that winter raised terrifying questions that echo through time. How quickly can fear make neighbors into executioners? How often is justice silenced by greed, and why does history seem to repeat itself? The Strasbourg Massacre serves as a warning, a reminder that when misinformation spreads, when hatred festers, and when people stand silent in the face of cruelty, the flames can be unquenchable. And once they start burning, they do not stop easily. Number 2. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, 1929. Chicago during Prohibition was a battleground for rival gangs vying for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. Chicago in the late 1920s was a city carved up by crime, where bullets settled disputes and loyalty meant survival. The Prohibition era had turned the city into a battleground, with rival gangs fighting for control of the lucrative liquor trade. At the heart of this war was Al Capone, the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld, and his fiercest enemy, George "Bugs" Moran. The streets were lined with speakeasies, secret clubs where liquor flowed freely despite the government's ban. Corrupt politicians and bribed police officers turned a blind eye as the city's most dangerous men waged war in the name of profit. Capone's empire was built on violence, and Moran's North Side gang was one of the few left standing against him. Tensions had been simmering for months. Moran had made attempts to disrupt Capone's business, hijacking shipments and killing key men in his operation. Capone, living in Florida at the time, decided it was time to end the feud once and for all. On the morning of February 14, 1929, Moran's men gathered at the SMC Cartage Company garage on North Clark Street. They were expecting a shipment of illegal whiskey. Instead, they were about to walk into an ambush. 4 men, 2 dressed as police officers, entered the garage. Assuming it was a routine raid, Moran's men didn't resist as they were ordered to line up against the wall. The moment they were in position, the disguised gunmen pulled out Thompson's submachine guns and opened fire. The roar of bullets echoed through the garage as the hitmen methodically gunned down their targets. The massacre lasted only a few minutes, but by the time the real police arrived, 7 men lay dead in pools of blood. Moran, by sheer luck, had arrived late and escaped death. Photos of the brutal scenes spread across newspapers nationwide, shocking the public. The massacre cemented Capone's reputation as the most feared man in Chicago, though he denied involvement. The authorities launched investigations, but no one was ever convicted. Despite the violence, the killings ultimately backfired. The brutality of the St. Valentine's Day massacre brought unwanted attention to organized crime, leading to increased efforts by federal agents to take down the mob. It was a turning point, marking the beginning of the end for Capone's reign. The St. Valentine's Day massacre is a chilling reminder of how far greed and power can drive men to violence. It also highlights how crime can thrive when corruption allows it to fester. The echoes of that bloody day still linger in Chicago's history, a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, betrayal, and the deadly consequences of a city ruled by the gun. Number 3. The Bombing of Dresden, 1945. In the final months of World War II, the Allied forces conducted a series of devastating air raids on the German city of Dresden. February 13, 1945. The war in Europe was drawing to a bloody close, but for the people of Dresden, the nightmare was just beginning. The city, known for its breathtaking architecture, art, and culture, had remained relatively untouched by the devastation that had consumed much of Germany. But that night, the sky above Dresden would turn red, and the world would bear witness to one of the most devastating aerial bombardments in history. Dresden, often called the Florence of the Elbe, had been a beacon of German culture. It was a city filled with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. Civilians believed Dresden would be spared, deemed strategically insignificant. But war had no mercy, and the Allied forces had different plans. As the Nazi regime crumbled, Britain and the United States sought to crush German morale. Dresden, a city with minimal air defenses, became the next target. Operation Thunderclap was set in motion, a calculated move to break the enemy's will and hasten the war's end. At 10:13 p.m., the first wave of Royal Air Force bombers appeared in the night sky. The sirens wailed, but for many, it was too late. The first bombs fell, igniting fires that quickly consumed the city. Hours later, a second wave arrived, dropping thousands of incendiary bombs. The inferno grew, creating a firestorm, a hellish vortex of flames that sucked the oxygen from the air and suffocated those who had taken shelter underground. The heat was so intense that buildings melted and the very air seemed to ignite. Streets were filled with charred bodies, some frozen in place as they tried to escape the unbearable flames. The U.S. Army Air Forces joined in the following day, dropping more bombs on the already smoldering ruins. By the time the assault ended, Dresden was unrecognizable. Over 25,000 civilians perished, their lives lost in a catastrophe that blurred the lines between military strategy and mass destruction. As the fires died down, the survivors emerged to a city of ash and silence. Some searched for loved ones, others simply wandered through the ruins, their minds unable to grasp the scale of what had happened. The beauty of Dresden, its centuries-old cathedrals, museums, and opera houses, had been reduced to rubble. The bombing of Dresden remains one of the most controversial events of World War II. Some argue it was a necessary evil hastening the fall of Nazi Germany. Others see it as a war crime, an unnecessary act of terror against a defenseless city. Even today, the debate continues. The destruction of Dresden is a sobering reminder of the horrors of war. It forces us to ask, how far should war go? When does strategy become cruelty? And how do we remember the innocent lives lost in the crossfire of history? Dresden was more than a military target. It was a city of people, families, artists, refugees, who on that February night became victims of a war that had already taken too much. The lesson endures. In war, there are no true victors, only survivors left to tell the tale. Do you remember parts of this story? Please share them in the comments below. Number 4, the Yaoundé Train Explosion, 1998. In Yaoundé, Cameroon, a train carrying fuel derailed due to a collision. It was a quiet afternoon in Yaoundé, Cameroon on February 14, 1998. The bustling capital city carried on with its daily rhythm. Markets were alive with chatter, taxis weaved through the streets, and families prepared for the evening ahead. But beneath the normalcy, an unseen catastrophe was brewing. At the Yaoundé train station, 2 trains were on a fateful path. One, a freight train carrying highly flammable fuel, the other a passenger train filled with unsuspecting travelers. What should have been an ordinary day of transport turned into a catastrophe when, due to a miscommunication or mechanical failure, the 2 trains collided on the tracks. The impact sent shockwaves through the station, derailing carriages and rupturing the fuel tankers. The smell of gasoline filled the air as a lethal cloud of vapor spread through the station. Panic erupted as people tried to flee, but others saw opportunity where they should have seen danger. As the fuel spilled freely onto the ground, local farmers, market vendors, and others from nearby areas rushed to scoop up the gasoline. Armed with buckets, jerry cans, and even their bare hands, they scrambled to collect as much as they could, hoping to sell it for profit. Some saw it as a lucky break, a chance to make money in hard times. Others simply wanted free fuel for their homes. But scooping spilled fuel is a deadly gamble. One wrong move, one spark, one static discharge, one careless cigarette could turn fortune into tragedy. And then, the inevitable happened. A spark, perhaps from metal grinding against metal, an exposed wire, or even a lit cigarette, ignited the spilled fuel. In a blinding flash, the train station was engulfed in flames. A deafening explosion tore through the air, shattering windows and sending a fireball rolling through the streets. The very people who had rushed in to collect the fuel were now at the heart of the inferno. Hundreds were caught in the blaze. Some perished instantly, while others ran engulfed in flames, their screams drowned by the roar of the fire. Nearby homes, shops, vehicles, and even lovers in red and white passing by became part of the destruction, feeding the blaze as it swallowed everything in its path. The thick smoke, black as night, billowed into the sky, visible for miles. When the fire finally relented, the scale of devastation became clear. Over 200 people lay dead and many more were severely burned. Hospitals overflowed with victims, their bodies charred beyond recognition. The city was left in shock, mourning those lost in a tragedy that never should have happened. Investigations revealed a combination of negligence and misfortune. Safety measures had failed, and the collision had turned the train station into a graveyard. The rush to collect fuel had only worsened the scale of the disaster. Questions arose. Who was responsible? Could this have been prevented? The answers came slowly, but for those who had lost loved ones, no explanation could undo the horror of that day. The Yaoundé train explosion is just one of many tragedies that highlight the dangers of scooping spilled fuel. Time and again, disasters have struck when people rush toward leaking gasoline, unaware of the invisible threat surrounding them. Fuel vapors are highly flammable and can ignite with even the smallest spark, causing devastating explosions that claim lives in an instant. Despite the desperate need that drives people to take such risks, the reality is clear. Scooping fuel is a death trap. What seems like an opportunity can turn fatal in seconds. Governments and communities must work to educate people on these dangers and implement safety measures that prevent such tragedies from happening again. The Yaoundé train explosion is a lesson in how fragile life can be. It forces us to recognize the hidden dangers in our everyday activities, the cost of poor safety regulations, and the devastating consequences of a single mistake. For those who lived through it, the fire of 1998 is not just a memory, it is a warning, a lesson written in flames and sorrow, urging us to never take safety for granted, because disaster often arrives without warning, and when it does, it changes everything in an instant. Number 5. The Assassination of Rafik Hariri, 2005. Rafik Hariri, a prominent and influential businessman and politician, served as the Prime Minister of Lebanon twice. On February 14, 2005, he was assassinated in a massive car bombing in Beirut. Beirut, Lebanon, February 14, 2005. The morning sun bathed the city in golden light as traffic weaved through the streets. The scent of fresh coffee and warm bread from bakeries lingered in the air, blending with the salty breeze from the Mediterranean. It was an ordinary day in the bustling capital, until it wasn't. Rafik Hariri was no ordinary man. A billionaire businessman turned politician, he had served as Lebanon's prime minister for much of the 1990s and early 2000s, playing a crucial role in rebuilding Beirut after the Lebanese Civil War. A symbol of resilience, he was loved by many, but also had powerful enemies. After resigning from office in 2004, Hariri became an outspoken critic of Syria's influence over Lebanon. His calls for independence and sovereignty made waves in the political landscape, unsettling those who wished to maintain control over the country. Hariri's armored convoy moved steadily along the city's corniche, a scenic seaside boulevard, accompanied by his security detail. The morning seemed routine until 12:55 p.m., when a white Mitsubishi truck parked along the road became the center of one of the most devastating assassinations in modern history. In an instant, Beirut was rocked by a massive explosion equivalent to 1,800 kilograms of TNT. A blinding fireball erupted, tearing through buildings, shattering glass, and sending a deafening shockwave across the city. The ground trembled as a massive crater opened up where the convoy had been moments before. Smoke and dust filled the air, reducing visibility to nothing but a choking gray fog. The blast's impact was catastrophic. 22 people, including Rafik Hariri, were killed. His body was found far from his destroyed vehicle, unrecognizable from the force of the explosion. Over 200 others were injured, their bodies covered in burns and deep wounds. Panic spread through the streets as sirens wailed and emergency responders rushed to the scene, battling flames and pulling survivors from the wreckage. In the immediate aftermath, theories swirled. The sheer scale and sophistication of the bombing indicated that it was no ordinary attack. Suspicion quickly fell on Syria and Hezbollah, both of whom had vested interests in silencing Hariri and maintaining their hold over Lebanon. The United Nations launched an investigation, leading to years of speculation and political upheaval. In 2011, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon charged 4 Hezbollah members with Hariri's assassination. By 2020, only one, Salim Jamil Ayyash, was convicted in absentia. The assassination had deep and lasting effects on Lebanon's political landscape, fueling protests, the withdrawal of Syrian troops, and ongoing tensions that still haunt the country today. Hariri's tragic death was more than an assassination, it was a turning point. His funeral drew hundreds of thousands of mourners, all demanding justice. His legacy as a visionary leader who sought to rebuild Lebanon was overshadowed by the very destruction he had sought to prevent. To this day, February 14th is not just Valentine's Day in Lebanon. It is a day of mourning, a day of remembrance, and a stark reminder of the price of power in a nation struggling to define its future. The assassination of Rafik Hariri reminds us of the fragile nature of stability in volatile regions. Political ambition, foreign influence, and deep-seated rivalries continue to shape the fate of nations, often at the cost of lives. The echoes of that fateful day still resonate in Beirut's streets, where the scars of the blast remain, not just in the city's infrastructure, but in the hearts of its people. Number 6, the Pulwama attack 2019. In the Pulwama district of Jammu and Kashmir, India, a suicide bomber attacked a convoy of Central Reserve Police Force (CRPF) personnel on February 14, 2019. It was a cold winter afternoon on February 14, 2019, when a convoy of vehicles carrying Indian paramilitary personnel wound its way through the highways of Pulwama, Jammu and Kashmir. More than 2,500 Central Reserve Police Force (CRPF) soldiers were traveling in 78 vehicles, heading from Jammu to Srinagar, an operation routine in its nature, yet destined to be forever etched in history. Among the usual traffic and security checkpoints, a white SUV, a Maruti Suzuki Eco, approached the convoy unnoticed. Inside, the driver, a suicide bomber linked to the Pakistan-based militant group Jaish-e-Mohammed, had one deadly mission: to strike with maximum impact. At 3:15 p.m., as the convoy moved along National Highway 44 near Lethpora, the SUV suddenly veered towards a bus packed with CRPF Jawans. Within seconds, the vehicle, laden with over 300 kilograms of explosives, detonated, sending an earth-shattering blast that obliterated the bus and sent shockwaves across the region. The explosion was deafening, tearing through the convoy with unrelenting force. 40 CRPF personnel were killed instantly, their remains scattered among the burning wreckage. Flames engulfed the twisted metal, and thick black smoke choked the air. The sheer scale of destruction left by the blast was incomprehensible, leaving survivors and onlookers in shock. Rescue teams rushed to the scene, but the damage had been done. The attack was the deadliest on Indian security forces in 3 decades of insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. As news of the carnage spread, a wave of mourning swept across India, plunging the nation into grief and fury. Hours after the attack, the terrorist group Jaish-e-Mohammed, GM, claimed responsibility. A video surfaced of the suicide bomber, a local Kashmiri youth named Adil Ahmad Dar, who had recorded his final message before carrying out the deadly mission. His radicalization was part of a larger insurgency fueled by long-standing tensions between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. India reacted with swift condemnation and resolve. On February 26, 2019, less than 2 weeks after the attack, the Indian Air Force IAF launched airstrikes on JM camps in Balakot, Pakistan, a significant escalation in hostilities between the two nuclear-armed neighbors. This led to aerial skirmishes, heightened military tensions, and global diplomatic interventions to prevent further escalation. The Pulwama attack was more than just an act of terror. It was a turning point in the ongoing Kashmir conflict. India responded with increased counterterrorism operations, diplomatic offensives, and a renewed commitment to security reforms. Every year, February 14th is remembered in India as a day of honor and remembrance for the fallen soldiers. The attack stands as a reminder of the sacrifices made by security personnel and the fragile peace that continues to be tested in the region. The Pulwama attack underscores the dangers of radicalization, the need for strengthened intelligence networks, and the complexity of the India-Pakistan conflict. As the world watches, one lesson remains clear: peace is fragile, but the determination to fight terror must never waver. Before we tell the last story, if you have stayed this far, thank you. We understand that these stories are heartfelt to families and victims who were affected by these tragedies, so perhaps we have missed out important information in these stories. Please assist us by writing them down in the comments section. Do not forget to hit the like and subscribe button too. Back to our story. Finally, number 7, the Parkland school shooting, a story of 2018. It was an ordinary afternoon on February 14, 2018, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Students were in their final classes of the day, eagerly anticipating the end of school. The halls buzzed with teenage chatter, and the air was filled with the lighthearted energy of Valentine's Day. At 2:19 p.m., a former student, Nicholas Cruz, arrived at the school in an Uber, carrying a legally purchased AR-15-style semi-automatic rifle. Wearing a backpack and carrying a duffel bag filled with ammunition, he entered the building through an unlocked door. Moments later, he pulled the fire alarm, sending students and faculty into confusion as they began to evacuate classrooms. Without warning, Cruz began his attack. He moved through Building 12, the freshman building, firing indiscriminately into classrooms and hallways. Students and teachers scrambled for cover. Some hid in closets, others behind desks, and many tried to flee. For nearly 6 minutes, the sound of gunfire echoed through the halls. 17 people were killed, including 14 students and 3 staff members, while 17 others were injured. Calls flooded 911 as terrified students sent desperate text messages to their families, whispering their goodbyes. Meanwhile, Cruz dropped his weapon, exited the school, blending in with fleeing students, and managed to escape the scene. He was arrested about an hour later in a nearby neighborhood. The tragedy shook the nation. Families were shattered, and an entire community was left reeling. The victims were mourned in tearful vigils, their stories retold in sorrow and disbelief. The pain of parents who lost their children, of classmates who survived but would never forget, of teachers who gave their lives protecting students was immeasurable. The Parkland shooting was not just another tragedy, it became a catalyst for change. Survivors, including students like Emma Gonzalez and David Hogg, turned their grief into action, leading one of the largest youth-led movements in modern history. Never Again and March for Our Lives became powerful symbols of the demand for gun control and safer schools. The debate over gun laws in the United States intensified. In the wake of the shooting, Florida passed new gun control measures, raising the legal age for firearm purchases and implementing red flag laws. However, the national conversation continued to divide, with passionate voices on both sides of the issue. To this day, February 14th is not just a day for love and romance, it is a solemn day of remembrance for the victims of Parkland. The scars remain, both in the hearts of those affected and in the ongoing struggle to prevent such tragedies in the future. The Parkland school shooting was a tragedy that shattered lives, but it also ignited a movement that continues to push for change. The voices of the victims and survivors echo in a singular message: never again. These 7 events, though spanning centuries and continents, share a common thread. They remind us of the enduring presence of tragedy in our world. By remembering these events, we can learn from the past, strive for a more peaceful future, and honor the memory of those who were lost. Thank you for watching a very tragic story. Please do well to stay safe. See you in our next video.